Greetings to all of you who have joined us from all corners of Zimbabwe, the region, Southern Africa, the continent, and the diaspora. A special welcome to our panelists I will introduce very soon. Today we are looking at the consequences of xenophobia, Afrophobia in South Africa. But we are dealing less with xenophobia and Afrophobia. We have done that before. Eleanor and Vavi were on this program a few weeks ago, and we went through that. But there will be references to it, especially since we are looking at the crisis at the level of removal of these people, human beings, from South Africa, and also at the reception, if you can call it that, in the respective countries. Now, we are well informed. I've tried to send to all of you. Maybe it was too short a notice. I got mine from Eleanor late afternoon, but I read it. It's an article by Sipho Mutati. It was in the Daily Maverick 2 days ago. Muramba China to Mabahambe, xenophobia and the grammar of removal. Likewise, there's also a report by Pilani Zamchia on his Facebook last Saturday on the horrors of the removal of people. And the Mutati article is so wonderful in the sense that it highlights that which others did, Vavi and Eleanor and Malukele, the previous program, of the horrific nature of Afrophobia, i.e. the hatred of people who look like you, who have lived with you, among you. And this article is so beautiful in that respect. And it shows, in particular, that those who are removing their fellow African citizens in the shanty towns and elsewhere are themselves descendants of people who were removed earlier in the apartheid era. So you have a kind of conflict among people in the same situation, class-wise, working class people. I'll leave that to read for yourself. But for us today, we'll have Diana Katia, that's French for Virgin, who was the chief of mission at the International Organization of Migration. Thank you, Diana, for agreeing to join us at short notice. And Diana will just give us the facts and figures as she sees them from their office on this humanitarian crisis in our region. And then we have Vavi, who's an institution in himself, General Secretary of the South African Federation of Trade Unions, SAFTU. Vavi, welcome. Nice to see you again. And then we'll have Fernando Lima, my old comrade from Mozambique. We know each other from the late 70s, huh, Chef? And right through.
Yes, true.
Yes, we are now much older now, but
true.
He's a journalist. You may have read his work. He's replacing Adriano Nuvunga. We had a brief bereavement in the family, close family this morning. So as countrymen, neighbors in Maputo, they made the deal which worked out very well. I think both are very well informed about the situation that we're dealing with. And then we'll have a young man, Ruben Tendai Mbofana, a social justice advocate, writer of note, researcher, and social commentator. Almost every day I read his stuff. It's tough stuff, if I may put it that way. Welcome, Ruben Tendai. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr.
And last but not least, my niece there, Eleanor Sisulu. I don't know how to introduce her, but she's a writer, a researcher. And I was just telling Diana Katia before she joined us that Eleanor worked with me, among others, in the 80s when we were dealing with a milder form of migration, the return of Zimbabweans from all over the world at independence. So, but Eleanor has been on this program before, in particular the last program when we discussed this very problem. So, Diana, it's your turn.
Thank you very much, Ibo. Thank you very much. Let me, as I mentioned to you, allow me, before going into the actual context, I think it's important, and apologies if this might have been something you've looked at in your previous sessions, but just to sort of frame what's going on in relation to how we're seeing migration around the world today, and put a bit of light, hopefully, and a bit of facts about really what is the reality about migration. And I'm honored to be here today and to have been invited and to be amongst all these amazing panelists and have this opportunity to sort of put a bit of evidence and facts and figures on this discussion. The first thing I want to say is that I think if you open the news today, anywhere around the world, we see that migrants are essentially scapegoats. They're scapegoats for all the ills that we see in many different societies, the growing inequalities that we see, deeper economic and social injustices, as well as political challenges. And we see this tendency, which is not new, but growing, about othering, assuming that let's blame others for the problems that we might have. Yet, one of the key elements that for us is important, and particularly at the International Organization for Migration, is the understanding that migration by itself, it's neither good or bad. It exists. It's there. It's as old as humanity. And the ability to make sure that we can see it as a benefit depends on how we manage migration. And right now, across history, we see that human mobility has driven innovation. It's driven economic growth, cultural exchanges, and opportunities around the world. And there are many examples of famous refugees, famous migrants who've made their life somewhere else and have brought all of those skills and experiences from their previous countries to their new countries. And yet at the same time, one of the things that we constantly see is these messagings, and especially now in this growing world of digital life and social media, where there's so much misinformation and myths that keep getting propagated. Myths such as that we are being overrun by migrants around the world, that African migrants are predominantly going to Europe, that migrants are the problem, they take away jobs, they lead to insecurity, and that in order to solve those problems, we just have to stop migration. So I just want to address some of these before going into the actual situation that we're seeing right now since roughly since the month of April. First of all, right now we have an estimated 304 million international migrants around the world. And that's from data from 2025. And it's a World Migration Report that IOM puts out every year. That's roughly 3.7% of the world population. The first time we put world migration reports was in 1995, where that percentage was 2.8. So really, in the space of these 30 years, that percentage has not grown very much. We're looking at roughly 3 to 4% of the world population are actually international migrants. And that's consistently been growing, but at a very steady pace as a result, seeing as since 1995, initially it was at 2.8. When we look at migration the migration from the African continent. There's this misconception that most are leaving, and I think, and I'm fairly certain that many of the people listening today know this already, but the vast majority of African migrants stay on the African continent. There are approximately 45 million international migrants that originate in Africa. And approximately 25 million of them live in another African country. And this is particularly relevant for us when we look at Southern Africa and we look at the history of movement across this region, where labor mobility and cross-border movement has been part of the history of the region for generations. Furthermore, when we look at African population, it's actually very similar to what we're seeing globally, where about 3% of African population are actually international migrants in and amongst Africa, but not living within their country. So very similar to this general 3.7 million international migrants that we see all over the world. The other element, which is this idea that if we stop migration, the problem disappears. And really, history, I think, has shown us otherwise. We cannot stop migration. We can make migration more and more difficult, pushing people to be irregular, to take very dangerous routes, as we see around the world. Now, a growing trend in the last 10 years towards Southern Africa from other parts of Africa, but we've seen them across the Americas, we see them across Asia, we see them from Africa to the Middle East. These are incredible, and obviously across the Mediterranean. So obviously incredibly dangerous routes for migrants to take that they are taking because they have limited options for regular and safe and documented migration. Migration, it's not the cause of problems, it's often a symptom of problems that we see in the countries of origin, as well as the countries or destinations that they are going to. People move because of unemployment, they move due to inequality, political instability, climate shocks, which we are seeing more and more, a growing climate mobility, and then demographic pressures as well. And so long as these issues remain, we will continue to see migration being a symptom of what we're seeing across the world. But at the same time, there's still incredible opportunity for people to make a choice to migrate. And this is what we need to move to, is this idea that there's nothing wrong with migration. In fact, it's incredibly powerful and can lead to development, but it needs to become a choice and not something that people have to do out of being forced to do it or out of necessity. The other element, which is very much linked to this idea that once we get rid of migration, we get rid of our problems, is that actually this idea that migrants are taking away jobs, they drain services, and they're creating the problems that societies face around the world. We know that migration, and I just said it does lead to economic growth. On the African continent, the remittance flows in 2024 were over $104 billion. This was twice the level of the official development assistance received in the continent at that same year. That's an incredibly powerful figure when you look at it just in terms of monetary. In the case of Zimbabwe, last year, $2.7 billion were received in formal remittances, not informal, but through formal means into the country. That's larger, obviously, than overseas development and larger still than foreign investments into the country. These transfers pay school fees, they buy food, they support healthcare, they build houses and small businesses across Zimbabwe, but across many different countries. So obviously, when we look at migration at a family and a community level, it's a strategy, it's a livelihood, it's a resilient strategy that people have to have. At the same time, migrants also provide benefits to the countries in which they go to. And I think we can see that closely when we look at the situation in Southern Africa. Oftentimes, when we look at Southern Africa, we assume a one-way journey into South Africa. And it's absolutely true that South Africa remains the largest migrant destination in the region. There's no doubt about it. But we know history has shown us that migration has happened from South Africa to Botswana, to Zimbabwe, between Botswana and Zimbabwe, DRC. We're looking at mass movements as a result of opportunity, looking at trade, looking at growing livelihoods, also seeking safety and protection across the region. And I think it's incredibly important to remember that this region has been built out of mobility. It's a region connected by the mobility, and the vast majority of movements within the Southern Africa are from migrants in the SADC region. So 60% of the migrants in South Africa come from other countries in the SADC region. 25% from the rest of the African continent, and just 11% from outside the continent. But it's also important to realize that when you look at South Africa in the context of global benchmarking, South Africa's migrant population is roughly about 4 to 5%, which is pretty much in the normal range for a middle to high income nation, where global international migrant usually are between 3 and 4%. In the case of high income global economies, that migrant population often exceeds 10 to 15%. South Africa is not at that level. It's really between 4 to 5% of the population. And it's important to keep that in mind because it's not an exception. It's not an isolated case. It's very similar to what we're seeing globally in relation to the type of economy that it has. Now, let me speak a bit more about what we see in Zimbabwe. And I was in Zimbabwe about 20 years ago during the early 2000s, 2005, when we were seeing also mass movements of Zimbabweans outside the country and significant movements into South Africa, but also a lot of Zimbabweans being returned and deported from South Africa. And at some point, up to almost 500,000 people in a year. Migration has changed significantly between Zimbabwe and South Africa in the last 20 years. Obviously, there's still labor and economically pressured or induced migration that happens to go into the mining, the agricultural, domestic work, and construction. But we also see a diversification of that migration. We see a lot more cross-border traders. We see a lot more students. We see a lot of people going to South Africa for family reunification because their relatives are there, their parents are there. And also a lot of transit migration, which are coming from other parts, transiting across Zimbabwe into South Africa. We see a lot more circular migration than we used to about 20 years ago. And IOM regularly, we have what we call the displacement tracking matrix, which looks at patterns of movements. And we've done it in Zimbabwe on and off over the last 25 years. And now we see a lot of circular movements where people are going for a short period of time, either as cross-border traders, so it's really an in and out movement, to maybe seek services that they cannot reach within wherever they live in Zimbabwe, or to look for work temporarily, but not necessarily for longer term movement and intention to remain in South Africa. And historically, do you hear an echo? Is it okay?
It was an echo. There was a small echo. Carry on. Yes.
Okay. Then historically, we've seen migration being dominated by men, but that's also changed, where now it's almost 50-50 in terms of the number of women that are also traveling to South Africa. They're moving independently. They've always been predominantly the cross-border traders, but now we've just seen an increase in cross-border trading. And they are also migrating for employment, be it short or long term, as well as business opportunities. So now when the situation that we've been faced with, and IOM has been working with the government of Zimbabwe since about the middle of May here in Zimbabwe, when we realized that we needed to be more prepared for what was happening and the implications that this would have on Zimbabweans in South Africa and on Zimbabweans returning back to Zimbabwe. And so since the middle of May, we started doing rapid assessments to understand the movements. And to be honest, I'd say the first 3 weeks, it was very hard to understand whether the movements that we were seeing, because there are constant movements across these borders, both at the official border post of Bight Bridge, but also many irregular crossings in the district of Bight Bridge, but really across the entire border. And it was hard to decipher whether the movements we were seeing were as a result of the situation transpiring in South Africa, or whether these were part of normal movements. And at some point, I'd say around the end of, probably about the middle and end of June, there was a shift where we saw more and more people telling us in our rapid assessment that their movement, their migration back, or their movement across the border was not planned. We had I think we had up to 74% saying this was unplanned movement, that they had decided at the last minute to return. And many of them citing safety concerns that they were finding. And it was a rapid assessment. We weren't going into a significant amount of detail, but just to gain a bit of that understanding. The government of Zimbabwe has so far, let me just give you the overall figures. So far, and these are hard to necessarily pinpoint as the official and final figures, but so far we have 104,000 Zimbabweans who have returned to Zimbabwe from South Africa since around the 15th of May. And the split of that is about 71,000 have self-repatriated. And what that means, and this was a terminology that was used during COVID as well. These were Zimbabwean, at the time of COVID, it was Zimbabweans who wanted to come back to Zimbabwe during COVID and remain in Zimbabwe during the COVID time. And now it was used again as a result of the situation in South Africa. And self-repatriated means that they have come across the border without official or legal travel documents, but they can prove that they are Zimbabwean, and hence they are allowed into the country. In addition to the 71,000 self-repatriated, just over 32,000 were assisted from South Africa by the government of Zimbabwe to return to Zimbabwe. So that's what makes up the 104,000. But it's important to note that, of course, there will be gaps, because some people will go and they have the regular travel documents, so they just go across the border, but they might have also been leaving as a result of the situation that was transpiring in South Africa. So it's important to highlight that, because these are not strict and final figures, because of just the difficulty of really gauging all of those movements happening. A lot of the assistance has been provided, particularly to those that were supported by the government to come back to South Africa. And over 425 buses have been received in Bight Bridge. And Bight Bridge, as you know, or as you may know, has the Bight Bridge Reception and Support Center that was created around 2005, 2006, to help Zimbabweans coming back into the country, at the time predominantly due to deportations. And that center has been running on and off since 2006. And now all of the supported repatriation happens and goes to the reception center, where they get received by government, where IOM and other UN partners are based as well to provide support that people need. A lot of that support so far has been in terms of transportation to return to their districts, or to go to the district that they choose and that they ask to go back to. They also get a bit of food, some non-food items, and then there's also counseling that takes place there with referrals to the health center if and when necessary. And really giving an opportunity to listen to people who have gone through a significant amount of trauma, either during the actual travel or in preparation for that travel. So one of the things, and I'll end here for others to step in, but one of the things that we are seeing as obviously we need to continue doing that support, but we have seen that the numbers in the last few days has gone down coming into the reception center, but that we need to be vigilant and we need to be available and we need to continue being there to support in case those numbers go up again. But the other element that's important is what happens next. If we have 104, let's use that figure, 104,000 Zimbabweans returning to their communities, what happens next in those communities? What sort of support do the migrants need or the returnees need now that they're back in their communities? The psychological trauma, the mental health support will still be necessary. The impact on children who've been out of school for X number of weeks or months and now have to be reintegrated into schools at the local level, the health needs that people have once they're back in their communities, but also the impact that this has on communities that might have been dependent on the remittances that they've been receiving from their relatives and now have one more person to feed, have no remittances coming in from outside, and having to find a solution and to determine, is this a long-term solution or is this short-term? Are people going to be here for weeks, for months, for years, or is there an anticipation that at some point they will leave again? So this is really some of the dilemma that we are working on now, is maintaining that support across ourselves, but also our UN partners and obviously the government of Zimbabwe, who's been leading on the response at Byte Bridge, but also with private sector engagement as well. But now looking at what happens in those districts, what happens to those individuals, and how do we support their communities with reintegration, with support at a community level, in order to ensure, once again, that should they decide to migrate, it's out of a choice and not because a necessity that they have because of a lack of opportunity in their own communities. So we're definitely not done looking at this. And even if those numbers shrink to no new movements, we still have to deal with what happens to these populations and how do we support people. And remembering that behind every single number, there is a man, a woman, a child that's been impacted by this, as well, of course, as their communities now. But let me end there, Ibo, and thanks again for having me today.
Thank you very much, Diana, for a beautiful outline of the whole migrant issue. It reminded me very much of Pope Francis, who said, we all have been immigrants or migrants at some time in our lives. And I think the outline you have given also helps to inform the alarmists in countries like South Africa and in general in Africa. They're very alarmist about migrants, and yet the history of migration has been so well documented. Thank you. I'll be coming back to you, Diana, because there's been a suggestion already, and I'll be asking Vavi about this just shortly, that what's happening in South Africa, the xenophobia, Afrophobia, is very similar to what happened in Zimbabwe in 2005, i.e. Muramba China. If you remember that. Muramba China means removal of filth. And Mabahambe means they must go. And the humanitarian impact of both these things in Zimbabwe, if you remember, it necessitated the UN rapporteur, Tibayuka, my former student at the University of Dar es Salaam, to come into Zimbabwe. And there is a suggestion that maybe South Africa too should be scrutinized along the same lines as was done in Zimbabwe in 2005. I'll come back to you on that. But now to Vavi. Vavi, the article I referred to by SIPO makes a very close comparison between Muramba China, which you know about, cleaning out the filth in 2005, and Mabahambe, meaning they must go. The similarities are in particular with respect to this role of the state. Remember, China was a state-driven exercise. Mabahambe is not directly so, but clearly, as Mutachi has shown, the state is complicit. She makes a very interesting thing. Operation Dudula, March and Mabahambe have been given enough room, ambiguity, and silence to look like permission. The state becomes the administrator of the consequences of its own failure, performing care at the point of exit for people it did not protect in the first place at the point of crisis. Look, it can say, we're here, we managed it, we helped them leave. Is that your characterization too? But would you say the South African state has been complicit in this?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Comrade Ivo. And let me thank you very much for inviting me back to this continuous discussion about what we now must recognize as an unfolding crisis of humanity in South Africa affecting the entire region. And let me thank Diane for this excellent outline and of the figures contextualizing not just about the region to which we belong, but also in the context of the international situation we are facing. Let me repeat what we have been consistently pointing out from the SAFTU perspective. Here we are dealing with a combination of factors, one of the most important of which is the system of global capitalism that is producing more crises for humanity, from unemployment, poverty, inequality, climate change, disasters, displacement of millions of people, and wars. That's what we are dealing with here broadly, politically. But having said that, there's always the dynamics of every local situation. And let me repeat, here in South Africa, we're facing unprecedented levels of unemployment now sitting at 43%, or over 13 million people unemployed. That unemployment continues to have a face, which is the Black people who were supposed to have been liberated. They have a face of the rural masses who came from the apartheid Bantustan reserves, the homelands. They have a face, the young people of our country, and the face of women. And so when you talk about those levels of unemployment, the cousin, brother, and sister of them will always be the levels of poverty, of a social crisis, from drug epidemics to violence to producing of more fatherless babies, and to women and children being the targets of that violence, and all manner of other things that we can speak about. So now asking and responding to you, dear Comrade Ibo, we're also dealing with a crisis of governance in South Africa. And let's situate this so that you can see the response of the South African government. This government is a government of a minority. Only about 1/3 of the South African population bothered to go participate in the last elections. Only about 1/3. 2/3 of the population, which are mainly the supporters of the ANC, have stayed away from the polls, for they no longer believe that a lot can change through an electoral system. They are sitting at home They are very angry. They feel betrayed. They are the face of unemployment, poverty, and inequality, and they are very angry. So that's a situation that we are facing broadly. Now you have a government that fears its own people, that have lost its legitimacy to be heard by its own people, that is now captured by fear and uncertainty. Now that it only has around 40% of the 1/3 of the population that bothers to go to vote in the elections. It can only capture 40%. It fears that that 40% may go down, and it certainly have not done anything in terms of addressing the structural crisis of poverty, unemployment, and inequalities to again ignite a sense of hope amongst the people who are sitting angry in the informal settlements and in the rural areas. So there's that context. And so when Sipom Tati writes an article that says the government is somehow complicit in the crisis, or at least in looking on the other side, I agree with that analysis totally, for this reason. Just like in the 2008 round of xenophobic attack that killed 64 people, this round of xenophobic Afrophobia attack would have been nabbed in the bud if we had a legitimate government, a less fearful government that it may lose support from these xenophobic mobs, if we had a government that was confident that it is on the right path of addressing the crisis that Black people inherited from the colonial, apartheid, and the capitalist systems. This government have looked on the other side and have given a sense to the mobs that are beating up people in the streets that the government and the police in particular support your actions. In fact, if you look at the situation in particular in KwaZulu-Natal, we have seen live images on the social media, on our television, that demonstrate that actually police have been there all along, accompanying and receiving people that are being arrested in the streets, contrary to the legislation that says only the police and only the Home Affairs officials can ask for identification documents from anybody. But the police have been cooperating, more like a receiving, and all they do is to wait in their vans and see people bleeding from being ruffled up and even beaten up before they get them into the vans. And so when people watch these images on social media, you don't then blame them from asking themselves that they better save their lives and go back to their countries, whether they are documented or undocumented. And I've explained this, Comrade Ibo. These guys have learned the art that there is a fight back by many people, that they seem to be attacking people even when they have documents. So in their press conferences, they talk about that this is a campaign against illegal, undocumented people. They call people illegal. That's their mentality. These illegal foreigners. That's their thinking. The people can be illegal. So once the cameras are off and once there are no mics, they go to what the campaign is all about. It targets every migrant, whether the migrant has document or no document. It targets every person that have a darker skin to them. And me, who have a darker skin, to most people, if I didn't have the profile, I guess that I could be randomly beaten up and asked to produce my documents. It targets anybody who doesn't appear to be understanding the local language. And that's why many of us have warned that beyond xenophobia, Afrophobia, there is a danger that there will be a new phenomenon of a tribal strife within South Africa, as people from other provinces believe that already they are not safe when they are visitors and workers in other provinces. There is a phenomenon absolutely embarrassing. Those of you who have been part of the liberation movement in our region, of people who are coming from the Limpopo, who are speaking Venda and Sijonga, who have been marching in the streets of Johannesburg for protection to the Human Rights Commission to say we feel unsafe because some of us have been beaten up. One worker was killed in Mossel Bay. One worker was beaten up in KwaGombo or East London. Another one was beaten up in the streets of Durban, all because they didn't speak the local languages. Now, this is a disaster unfolding. Now, you are asking us to come and speak about what do we do about this. And the first thing that I think we must say is that we can no longer just talk about a crisis of migration, but we must talk now about an unfolding crisis of unfolding human crisis. If you will know, I think all of us are aware that documented migrants who came here as asylum seekers, who got documented as refugees, who got integrated into the communities of South Africa, in this case in point of Durban in KwaZulu-Natal, have been targeted. And out of fear and saving their own lives, have now been spending 9 weeks in the streets of Durban. 9 weeks. In the process, they have been harassed, they have been beaten up. At least 4 women gave birth in those pavements with the assistance of one another, as they fear that going to the local clinics and hospitals will expose them to further violence. So as we are having this webinar today, there are about 500 people or so from the DRC in the main who ran away from that instability stoked by international imperialism, who thought that South Africa will be a safer place for them, but who are now spending 9 weeks in the streets. And I'm sure you've seen this, that in Cape Town, I can't remember how many thousands of undocumented migrants, mainly from Zimbabwe and Malawi, spent 2-3 days in that rain of winter. I don't know whether you know Cape Town can be quite chilly in winter. Imagine spending 2-3 nights in the rain, in the open. That's the debate that we should have. The campaign to dislodge, to ban, to remove small business owners from their operations, whether they are documented or not, continues. We normally talk about a low intensity war, but this is not just a low intensity war. This is a reign of terror orchestrated by thugs who believe that they have the support of the state. And because of what they would have seen elsewhere, the police accompanying the people beating up other people in the streets. Now, those of us who were here in the run-up to the 1994 elections, and those who witnessed 16,000 people being killed in KwaZulu-Natal because of what we used to call the black-on-black violence, which the TRC revealed to have been an orchestrated strategy of the apartheid regime to destabilize the liberation movement will know that this strategy is not new, of the police accompanying the attackers. And sometimes, as we witnessed in the Val Triangle, where I used to be a resident, when this violence was transported from KwaZulu-Natal to the reef, now Gauteng, would have seen how police used to even paint their faces black as they lead the hostel dwellers who would have been mobilized and or who would have, out of fear, been forced to go and join attacks against people that they have absolutely nothing against. We are back there if we are not careful, comrades. That unfortunately, our government, now crippled by fear and fearing losing elections, in particular on the 4th of November, as we now can see a clear political collaboration between the March and March and Umkhonto weSizwe party led by the former president of the ANC, Jacob Zuma, and other political parties who have been mobilizing on the basis of anti-migration, such as the ACDP, the Patriotic Alliance, and others, who stand to benefit from this mobilization. And the poor government led by the ANC is now sort of in dire straits. They don't know what to do. They can feel the pressure and from the African continent and the international community that they must do something. They've had press conferences, but they won't push hard enough to communicate an unequivocal statement that they will not allow this state of barbarism to unfold in the country, even if it is enjoying some popular support among some conservatives and or people who have genuinely been misled into believing that there are between 15 to 30 million migrants in South Africa. Contrary to what we've heard tonight, these people simply believe that there is between 15, 25, 30 million undocumented workers, which will constitute about half of the population of South Africa today. That's what we are dealing with here. So what do? We must mount the pressure locally and internationally. Today, SAFTU, together with a coalition of 160 civil society organizations, had a press conference in which they highlighted this unfolding human crisis tragedy unfolding in Durban and in other parts of the country. Surely the immediate task is to pressurize government to find alternative accommodation for the people who are sleeping in the pavements of Durban. Surely where people feel that they are unsafe, the government have a responsibility, even if those people are seeking to be deported and moved into their respective countries, to provide security and not to say to them, you go back to your communities and or we deport you. There cannot just be two choices, that there are people who are legally here as refugees given that type of irresponsible response by the government. Surely we've got to continue to say the government must implement its own laws, must improve its own border management controls, must ensure that the employers do not take advantage of vulnerable workers from the region, but more importantly, must maintain, I'm sorry to use this language, law and order in the streets, and must not be seen to be conniving and or condoning acts of violence directed against migrants, whether they are here documented or undocumented. That's the secondary issue. The first and the most important issue is that these are human beings. And the Constitution of South Africa offers a protection against any kind of violence and barbarism on all citizens of the world once they become part of South Africa, irrespective of their legal status. The government of South Africa have a responsibility to offer them a protection. And today, unfortunately, part of this thing being driven all over is that government is seen to be sympathetic, condoning, or fearing to act decisively against the mobs that are ravaging the streets. That's what we are dealing with here. So I hope that a lot of discussion will be about what are the immediate pressure points we should be looking at. Yesterday, I read a letter sent to me by the comrades from Denmark, and they copied me, and this letter was directed to the embassy of South Africa in Denmark. And that letter was very clear that South Africa have to do something about the unfolding crisis in the streets of South Africa. Surely, just like we did, Comrade Ibo, against the operation Remove the Debt in the Streets of Zimbabwe in 2005, we coordinated international solidarity to put pressure on the regime of Robert Mugabe at that time. We've got to do the same thing against the regime led by President Cyril Ramaphosa in South Africa in 2026, because the circumstances are not very, very different. The circumstances are just not very different. Thousands and thousands of people are being displaced and back to their countries to face whatever that made them to escape their countries in the first place. And the government doesn't seem to appreciate the regional destabilization effort that they are condoning to unfold in front of their own eyes. And once that happens, with trade unions all over the region and all over the continent, all over the international communities, the NGOs, the civil society formations must begin to say to the government, you have to act to protect human rights in your own country, and or accept your own, that you're returning back to the status that the apartheid regime once enjoyed of being a pariah state. Thank you.
Thanks, Vavi. Thanks very much. Very profound as usual. And we have noted the recommendations you have made. These, of course, relate primarily to South Africa itself. And I think you have answered my question very well indeed. It's very sad. Let me move on to Tendai Bufana. We have so far we've been looking at the South African situation as it affects the migrants who have been thrown out. I think Vavi has been very graphic. We'll hear more of it from Eleanor just now. But can you tell us what's the situation, what's the response of the Zimbabwean government, the state, to this unfolding humanitarian crisis? Tendai?
Yes, thank you so much, Professor, Prof. It's good to be here, and thank you again for the invite. The short answer to your question is that the response has been nothing more than insulting. I can call it that, insulting. So far, what we've heard from the government here in Zimbabwe is that there's been talk about sending of buses, that there's going to be buses that are going to be sent to South Africa to fetch all those that are coming back home. And we've also heard the same with the director that had just spoken, that at the border there are some coordinated efforts to fast track the processing of retainees. And we've also heard from the highest officers in the land of encouraging Zimbabweans to welcome and reintegrate those Zimbabweans who are coming back from South Africa, and also even that the children should be accepted back into schools. There should be made room for them, and so forth. But in all that talk, as much as it is good, it is positive that there is something being done or said to be done. We don't know if it's actually happening on the ground. It's addressing the fundamental issue here. The elephant in the room is, why did these people leave Zimbabwe in the first place? As already been alluded to, the main issue is economic. We know that the exodus of Zimbabweans mainly to South Africa, some to Botswana, and a few others to the United Kingdom was primarily triggered by the economic meltdown soon after the dawn of the new millennium. After the land reform program, violent as it was, the economy collapsing, the hyperinflation, the company closures, the unemployment reaching, shocking levels of over 95%, which left a lot of Zimbabweans trapped in a cycle of poverty. And they decided to leave the country for greener pastures or for survival. It was not even for greener pastures, because there were no pastures in Zimbabwe. So it was for them to seek survival, or else they'll die. So 20-something years later, we see the same Zimbabweans being kicked out of South Africa and told to go back home. And they are back. We are told that we are looking at a number of around 104,000 Zimbabweans that have returned so far. But they are coming back to the same country that they fled from. They are coming to the same country of lack of opportunities. They are coming to the same country of over 90% formal unemployment. They are coming back to a country with a very high cost of living. How are these people supposed to integrate? We can welcome them back as families and friends and say, "Come, welcome. You can stay in my house. I can take care of you," as hard as it will be, that because those are 2, 3, 4, 5 extra mouths to feed. But how are these people going to survive? How are they going to take care of their families that they brought back, or the families that they were taking care of while they were in the diaspora, and they left their children and their wives or husbands back home? So that lack of opportunities is what is going to trigger an even worse humanitarian crisis than what we are faced right now. It's bad enough as it is at the moment, but there is a chance that it can trigger civil unrest in Zimbabwe itself. Because how are these 104 and counting? More of them are coming back. I've been speaking to a few Zimbabweans who are still based in South Africa, and they are talking of coming back. Even the government itself, I remember yesterday, was it, when the Minister of Information and was talking about possibly accommodating 1.4 million Zimbabweans who could be returning. But they talk as if it's so easy to reintegrate 1.4 million Zimbabweans. At one point, we were shocked to hear the ZANU-PF spokesperson, Chris Mutsvangwa, on South African television. I think it was Newsroom Africa, boasting that Zimbabwe had the capacity to absorb these people. He was talking about the fastest growing economy in the region. He was talking about nearly everyone in Zimbabwe being gainfully engaged in income, generating projects, gold mining, and so forth. But that is ridiculous. Zimbabweans are suffering. We are looking at a country where reliable information tells us that 50% of the population right now is surviving on less than $2.15, which is characterized as extreme poverty. We are looking at about 65% of Zimbabwe's population said to be living in general poverty. And some statistics even put 85% of Zimbabweans living in upper middle economy poverty. So those are not enviable figures. Those are not figures that we can go on Newsroom Africa and boast about. You know, it's one thing to talk about flashy figures of the fastest growing economy of 6% economic growth rate, and yet that is not translating into an improved standard of livelihood for the ordinary citizens. Zimbabweans are getting poorer. Actually, Zimbabweans are poorer today than they were in 2017 when this government came to power. So when we hear of 104,000 Zimbabweans who are back to right now in Zimbabwe, how are they surviving? How do they, what real opportunities are there for them to continue taking care of themselves and their families, and even with the black tax of their extended families, their grandmothers, their aged mothers and fathers and cousins and everyone else that they've been taking care of for the past 10, 15 years? How are they going to genuinely reintegrate? Because the most logical form of reintegration is not necessarily social. It's economic, it's financial. So as long as the government is not talking, you know, real figures, real policies and plans that improve the economy of Zimbabwe, because there is no way the government of Zimbabwe can say, all right, we are going to open up jobs for the 104,000 Zimbabweans who have returned from South Africa, when the rest of us are unemployed. How are they going to do that? You know, that is cycle. So this is a problem, Prof, in that I foresee if this issue is not immediately addressed, it's either those people who are back from South Africa today are already planning to go back, because they'll always have to come up with another plan of how to go back. And this time, hopefully go to a different area than where they were before they were kicked out. If we were staying in Joburg, we might make a plan to go back and stay in Polokwane or in Durban or somewhere else, or somewhere where they think there's less of this match and Dudula, because I'm sure there are some areas in South Africa where it's a bit quieter. But you are going to see in those areas, very soon there's going to be an influx of these same migrants that they kicked out. They're going back very soon. Those who decide to stay in Zimbabwe, there might be some social unrest in the future, in the near future, because as long as they are back here and there are no opportunities for them, they will become even more disgruntled. Join that with Zimbabweans who are already here, who are already disgruntled. That is a powder cake that can explode at any time. So we need to see the government of Zimbabwe making some real tangible moves to improve the economy of Zimbabwe, to open up opportunities for investment, opportunities for real empowerment, even if it's self-empowerment. Let's see that on the ground, not distributing of cars and cash. That is not empowerment. We need to see real empowerment that will get the people of Zimbabwe to take care of themselves and their families. We also need to see, I know Comrade Vavi did mention the ANC and its lack of legitimacy. That is another problem that is also affecting us here in Zimbabwe. If the ANC government was serious, they would introspect and do a post-mortem and say, why are there so many Zimbabweans in South Africa in the first place? We've already mentioned economic mismanagement, corruption is very rife and rampant in Zimbabwe. Right now, we are talking about CAB 3, which is now an act, constitutional amendments that's extending the terms of office of those that empower the parliament and the president. All these things are a threat to the stability of Zimbabwe. All these things are a threat to the economy of Zimbabwe. And there is a serious danger that as the economy and the political situation in Zimbabwe continues to deteriorate, it will push more Zimbabweans out into South Africa. So the South African government should be proactive. Where are they all this time? In coming to their brothers and sisters in ZANU-PF and pushing them to implement real economic policies that advance the livelihoods of Zimbabweans, not self-serving policies that we have been seeing of late, like this Constitutional Amendment number 3, which has got nothing to do with the ordinary people of Zimbabwe, but it's got everything to do with the entrenchment of power of a few people. So where is President Ramaphosa? He was here 2 months ago. We understand clandestinely. Did he talk about constitutional amendments? Did he push his Zimbabwean brother not to go ahead? If he did, certainly he was not listened to, because now we have the constitutional amendments in law. Where we saw the president of South Africa meeting with some very shady characters here in Zimbabwe who are being accused of massive corruption and looting of national resources that are contributing directly to the economic crisis that we are seeing in Zimbabwe. So what pressure did the South African government put on the Zimbabwean leadership to crack down on corruption, to crack down on high-level looting of national resources, so that these resources that are going into the pockets of 2, 3, 4 individuals can benefit the people of Zimbabwe? That is how we can curb this consistent and persistent influx of people into South Africa from Zimbabwe. We need a Zimbabwe that works. We need a Zimbabwe whose economy provides opportunities. Zimbabweans who are going to South Africa are not going there for fun. Most of them are not happy in South Africa. They're not happy leaving their children here in Zimbabwe. I know of women who have not seen their own children in 2 years, 3 years. If they are fortunate enough, they only see each other once a year during Christmas. Can we honestly say that that woman who's doing domestic work in South Africa is happy? She's not. She would rather be here with her children. But the very fact that she is still there and staying in South Africa is out of necessity, because she knows that coming back here will be as good as death because of the economic situation. She will not be able to take care of her children. So we need to put that in mind and say Zimbabweans do want to go back home, but they want to go back home to a country that is working, to a country that is functional, to a country where they can live a decent life, of a country that possesses some of the world's most sought after minerals, like lithium, like gold, like platinum, and all these minerals. Why are those resources not benefiting the people of Zimbabwe? Is it not an embarrassment that a country that is continually boasting of the fastest growing economy in the region is the home to so many migrants that are leaving the country? It's an embarrassment to so much poverty. Some of the poorest people on the African continent are from Zimbabwe. Why is that? So we need our brothers and sisters, our comrades, the so-called former liberation movements, to finally go back to those ethos of the liberation struggle, because I believe the liberation struggle was fought for the ordinary people of South Africa, of Zimbabwe, of Mozambique, of Namibia, and all these countries in the Southern African region. It was supposed to be about the ordinary people. It was not supposed to be about those that are in power. So let's see those former liberation movements, if they are still standing true to their ideals, to come together and pressure the Zimbabwean government to do what is best for the people of Zimbabwe, to put the interests of the people of Zimbabwe first before those that are in power. Only then can we see real change in the Southern African region, real change in Zimbabwe, where both the Zimbabwe itself becomes prosperous and stable, and as a result, South Africa itself becomes prosperous and stable, and they don't have to worry about us, because we'll be back in our own country, living our own lives. Thank you.
Thanks, Tendai. Thanks for that. I'll be coming back to you to reflect on the role of SADC. Interestingly, throughout this crisis, not a single statement from SADC Secretariat. We have to ask, is SADC still there? And therefore, I think the point you make, the need for some kind of unified action in the region is necessary. But I don't know, we'll talk about it later. Fernando, come start, Chef.
Everything okay?
Ready? You okay?
Yes, I'm ready. Yes.
Fernando, please tell us what's going on in Mozambique with regard to this crisis.
Well, I would say to start with that we are in a state of shock because yes, we were heard about Operation Dundula, March, and everything, and we always thought that this is something going on in South Africa. This is something against Ethiopians, Somalis, DRC people, Ghana, Nigeria, but nothing will happen to Mozambicans. Well, why is that? Because we still dream about that South Africans are our brothers, as we call it more colloquially. We call it in-laws. I think is a joke derived from the fact that Graça Machel married Nelson Mandela. So we kind of felt protected by all sorts of alliances with South Africa, and especially with the South Africans, as have been mentioned here before. A lot of people in Mozambique have relatives in South Africa. We speak the same language, at least on border provinces like Mpumalanga, like Limpopo. So we kind of are in shock, as I'm saying once again, because it's the same blood as we would think about that in relation to Malawians, because we believe that Mozambicans and Malawians, we belong to same families, and just all these colonial borders that divide us in Southern Africa. So having people being confronted with the fact that they need to return back to Mozambique is kind of uh, not, I would not say that is a betrayal, but it's something that looks like unnatural. This is the human or the emotional side of it, because then you have the political perspective. We always thought, and I think this is a more dubious angle, which is we were the ones supporting ANC, we were supporting the struggle in South Africa. So, as a kind of reward, South Africa and South Africans should support Mozambicans that go to South Africa to work or to survive, because there's a different type of Mozambicans that go up to South Africa. You have around 40,000 Mozambicans that work in the mines. They are all legal. Until now, there were no problems with Mozambicans in South African mines. Then you have another sector that work in the farms in South Africa, mainly in Mpumalanga, which is the province across the border, and so people don't are not around urban areas. They work in the farms, so to a certain extent, they are out of all this mass that you see on TVs of these mobs going door to door, chasing migrants. Despite Johannesburg is as a big urban center, it also has thousands and thousands of Mozambicans. But we should put the figures in context to have a broader sense of what are we talking about here. So Mozambican authorities believe, and I think this statistics is also a little bit crazy, that 300,000 to 400,000 Mozambicans are now living in South Africa. I'm not sure about those numbers because I do not see any formal statistics to confirm those numbers. And embassy service, consular services do not have those figures. And then when you talk about people returning back to Mozambique, as you compare it with the figures that were here mentioned related in relation to Zimbabwe, officially we have 1,300 Mozambicans that have crossed the border back to Mozambique. So 1,300 compared with 300,000 Mozambicans, it's nothing. Nine people dead, killed by mobs. Still, every human life counts. But 4 people dead, it's not just this kind of mass killings of Mozambicans in South Africa. So we are confronted by the horrors we see on TV screens and all other sorts of reporting. But on the other hand, the figures are not wide. So this means what? This means that the government up to now have managed to provide minimum support for the people at the border, mainly at the border with Ressano Garcia, and then provide transportation for people to go back, especially to the provinces in southern Mozambique, like Maputo, Gaza, and Inhambane. So I would say that the real crisis it will be it will happen later because I'm sure if this movement in South Africa will not be stopped, it will not be solved, it will not be addressed politically, more and more Mozambicans will come across the border. And yes, there is a problem with the legality because most of the Mozambicans that are in South Africa, they do not have any papers, or if they have papers, they are not going across immigration laws, meaning you are entitled to remain in South Africa on a kind of a ordinary visa for 30 days. After 30 days, you need to renew your entry in your passport. And most of the Mozambicans do not respect that. Most of the Mozambicans do not even have papers to stay in South Africa. So what we have at this point on the Mozambican side is people looking into what we called brown passport. The Mozambican regular passports are have blue covers. The special passports for Mozambicans looking for jobs and work on the mines or on the farms in South Africa, they have special passports called brown passports. And so, what we have at this point, despite all the negative images that we see on TV screens, is more and more Mozambicans look into legal documents to go back to South Africa and find a job in South Africa. And if you see people being interviewed after their arrival, a sudden arrival at the border, they all say, well, we are just here, just waiting for the situation to calm, and we will return back to South Africa because we don't have jobs in Mozambique. That's in South Africa where we can do something. So you have this situation in which you are confronted with the horrors that we see in the media, but by the same token, you have a lot of Mozambicans that clearly admit that they want to go back to South Africa, either legally or illegally, because that's where they can get some money to send to their families. The IOM person that spoke on this panel, they mentioned the remittances to Zimbabwe from Zimbabweans working in South Africa. We don't have. I'm sure that the government have those figures, but those figures are not public for Mozambique economy, and they are very important because in rural Mozambique, especially on the country in the countryside in the southern provinces, the remittances of Mozambican workers, legal or illegally, staying in South Africa, are very important for those rural areas. In fact, the remittances of coming from South Africa are the kind of the blood that have the economy circulating on those provinces in the countryside. And as you know, there is also a cultural side to the immigration to South Africa, which is important. You are not a real man if you do not spend some time working in South Africa. Well, in the past, this was related to work in the mines. Today, it's more broadly seen as you need to go to South Africa to prove that you are a man, not only that you are brave, you are courageous, but also that you can bring back enough money to marry, to pay lobolo, to get a wife. So these are kind of traditional practices that relates Mozambicans and South Africa. So I would say that the real consequences are yet to be seen in Mozambique, because the figures are still uh, very weak. But we should also look into other angles to this problem. One of the reasons why people are in shock here, it's the low response that Mozambicans and even the Mozambican government get out of the South African government. You know, at the early stage of this crisis, President Chapo traveled to South Africa as kind of seeing Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa, it will solve the problem. Of course, it did not solve any problem. And on the other hand, we do not think, and we are not seeing any actions by South African government to solve the crisis or to address politically this crisis. I should have to mention here Mr. Jacob Zuma, and is in what we've seen here at this side of the border as incitements to xenophobia, and his party being also campaign on this March movement. Mr. Jacob Zuma uh, lived for many years in Mozambique. So Mozambicans felt to a certain extent betrayed by Jacob Zuma and Jacob Zuma's party positioning on this March movement. And so, but in the past, it should also be mentioned as a fact that every week around 100 Mozambicans are deported for a detention center in the outskirts of Johannesburg called Lindela, and send it back to Ressano Garcia. So Mozambicans have been for many years being deported from South Africa on weekly basis because they were illegally in South Africa. But is this a problem just of the South African government? No, it's not a problem of just South South African government. It is also a problem for Mozambique. One, in terms of migration, when it turns to Tanzanians, to Malawians, and to other Africans like Ethiopians and Somalis that are in transit to work in South Africa, there is always an hostile attitude from Mozambican authorities related to these migrants. And we do not have the right um, perspective on those people that are coming across our country in order to reach South Africa. So they were not coming to Mozambique to work in Mozambique. They were crossing the border to South Africa. But the local authorities always portrayed those immigrants as someone negative, some people that are stealing from us are eventually stealing jobs from the Mozambicans, and this is not fair. This is not right because these people are not struggling to get jobs in Mozambique. The second aspect is about creating jobs in Mozambique to prevent these hundreds of thousands of Mozambique go across the border to find jobs there. We have plenty of land in Mozambique, but this plenty of land is not being explored, is not being worked. Why? Because a lot or a significant portion of this land are in the hands of Frelimo, uh, powerful people. Frelimo is the leading party in Mozambique, and those people are just waiting for a commercial opportunity to speculate on that land, for example, to sell it to a South African farmer or a South African businessman to come to work in Mozambique. So these Mozambicans that go across the border to work on the farms in South Africa, they could being working in farms in Mozambique, producing the same kind of products that ironically enter Mozambique by the value of millions and millions of dollars. We can say that most of Mpumalanga economy and Mpumalanga main city, Nelspruit, have been developed by the money coming from Mozambique and by the Mozambicans. We should be able to produce lettuce and tomatoes and onions in Mozambique, but we just developed this trade across the border to go to South Africa and to bring all these vegetables and all these products to feed the Mozambicans with what is being produced in South Africa, which is a shame. And yes, that is something that should be addressed by SADC, but never addressed. And of course, South Africa as a country and as an economy is delighted to have all these farms and agribusiness being very busy to produce for Mozambique. Even if you take into account that fact, we should see a more solidarity attitude from South African establishment, South African government, and ANC towards Mozambique. It's not just southern Mozambique; it's all Mozambique. If the border at Rosano Garcia closes for a couple days, immediately the prices start rising in Tet, in Niassa, and in Cabo Delgado, which are provinces further up north, but they are also being getting supplies from South Africa because most of the agriculture products in this country are being produced in South Africa, and this is a distortion of our economy is a distortion of our official policies. And this is, yes, the current crisis just claims or just remind us how our economy is distorted, but this has nothing to do with South Africa or with South African authorities. This has to do with policies in Mozambique, policies being promoted by Frelimo and its government in Mozambique. It's a disgrace. And yes, it should be, if one can say that this humanitarian crisis should be an opportunity to address our own internal crisis, yes, we should do much, much more to produce more agriculture projects in Mozambique instead of just going across the border and bring in hundreds and hundreds of trucks of agriculture products to be sold in Mozambique. And the irony, and I end at this point, is that most of those products are being produced by Mozambicans at South African farms, mainly at Mpumalanga province.
Thanks, Fernando. Yes, I agree entirely with you that the relationship between South Africa and Mozambique geographically, there should be no distinction at all, especially southern Mozambique.
Yes.
And same thing with Zimbabwe and Mozambique, and indeed in all our countries. I'll come back to you, Fernando, on recommendations. What's to be done now? But let me go to Eleanor now first. Eleanor.
Okay. Thank you, Ibo. I'm just getting my camera. Okay. Okay. So I'm so glad I spoke after Vavi, because I think he said a lot. He outlined the situation very well. And so I don't need to repeat too much, except to say that I want to make a strong recommendation. And it was inspired, this recommendation is inspired by Sipho Mthathi's article, Murambatsvina, Magahambe, same vocabulary, because this campaign is targeted against Black working class people. As Vavi said, there's this myth, it's about people being undocumented, people being illegal. But the fact is, there are undocumented people in other communities in South Africa. And it's assumed, I mean, you've had all sorts of, if you talk about crime as well, you've had crime in all communities in South Africa. Nobody can point a finger to the other when you talk about crime. So I think the recommendation I want to make is that we need to have a UN rapporteur, to ask for a UN rapporteur on human rights to come into South Africa and compile a report along the lines of the one that Anna Tibaijuka did for the Operation Murambatsvina. Okay, the politicians ignored the Tibaijuka report, but it's there as a historical record. And I think we need a report which outlines in great detail what is actually happening to people on the ground here and what is happening to the different migrant communities. The stories of horrible human tragedy that are playing out. The question, and it seems a question that no one asks, and that is quite shocking, that a group of people who are essentially vigilante groups can declare a deadline for people to move, and that the state almost accepts that deadline. The South African government put 600 million, this is from the government sources, that they say they spent on the 30th of June. And one asks oneself, if that 600 million could have been spent actually investing in the communities that are most impacted by migrants or have the largest migrant presence, what would have been the outcome? How many jobs would 600 million rand generate? So I think, you know, a UN special rapporteur or some kind of international interrogation, and I think this has to come from the international working class, that we must have a serious documentation. If we can't get a UN rapporteur, we need to engage and need to mobilize the resources for a serious documentation of the human tragedy that is happening, so that we can actually work out ways to prevent it going forward. I want to say there's sometimes you regret not documenting things. And I'm sure Comrade Vavi would recall, because he actually traveled. He was one of those South Africans. At the time, there were a number of South Africans very active in preventing or working against the Afrophobic violence. And we call it Afrophobic because it's targeted against Black working class people. And the blacker you are, the more you will be targeted. That is the reality. And we mobilized migrant communities. At that time, I was with Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition, the South African Council of Churches, the interfaith community in South Africa, various social justice movements, the trade unions. There were plans for an attack in the lead up to the 2010 World Cup, for a repeat of 2008. It was very clear in social media. Well, there was less of a social media presence at that time, but it was very clear communication among groups planning large-scale attacks on migrants in the run-up to the World Cup. And these organizations, led by the South African Council of Churches and the different social justice, civil society formations, we actually prevented that from happening. The UN was involved, the International Organization of Migration and the UNHCR, as well as, and the police responded. And there's the part of me, the cynical part, that says that they responded because the government didn't want the embarrassment before the World Cup, the 2010 World Cup. Because you can imagine people would have been coming for the World Cup in the wake of this embarrassment of mass murder of migrants. So that was prevented, and I think it's a historical, story that we must tell. I want to say, Fernando, that we see horror reports on the media. It is just the tip of the iceberg of what people are experiencing. What people are experiencing today, all these migrants that have to leave, whether it's to Zimbabwe, Lesotho, the ones that had to leave for Ghana, Nigeria, it is horrific. People have lost in the threat of their lives. They've lost, in addition to their lives being threatened, they have lost property. They have been, had to sell or leave property. The trauma of having to leave. I mean, why give a deadline in the middle of winter? It seems that these things are always done in the middle of winter. Operation Murambatsvina was in the middle of winter. And at the same time, people were being killed in Zimbabwe in the run-up process of the 2008 elections. Now, who decided why on the 30th of June people must leave? And why would a government accept such a deadline? And this was stated months ago. They should have engaged with those communities, because even if one accepted that people must leave, even if one accepted that, what would have been wrong with a staged leaving, a staged departure, giving people notice and saying, if you don't have documents, you have 90 days to leave the country or whatever, even 30 days. There's reports of people having to vacate their spaza shop in 20 minutes. So clearly, that is an excuse for looting, dispossession, and the kind of thuggery that Vavi has spoken about. So to address this humanitarian situation, we need a continental appeal to the UN to send a special rapporteur. And we need to construct a counter-narrative. And that counter-narrative actually must hold all our governments to account and our regional institutions, because one of the greatest crimes and the greatest threat to working class people, to poor Black people, is corruption. Corruption is what is eating up jobs, both in Zimbabwe, South Africa. Comrade Fernando is talking about Mozambique. Corruption is eating up jobs. And we unfortunately are in the grip of this techno-fascist world order, in which AI is coming like a tsunami and is going to eat more jobs. So I think working class solidarity, social justice, civil society organizations, a continental organization of progressive forces, and it's not going to come from the liberation movements. I think the liberation movements have abandoned their ideals, and it's for us working in civil society to try and rebuild a counter-narrative and a pan-Africanist project that encompasses the youth. Graça Machel had a meeting, the Graça Machel Foundation, in 2008, post the xenophobic violence in South Africa, or the Afrophobic, let me be more precise. And at that meeting, a major recommendation from working class youth in the region was that they don't have a chance, as we did, our generation during the liberation struggle, to travel across Africa and form regional and continental solidarity. And we somehow have to create those opportunities. I mean, Ibo, I have acknowledged that you forced me to go and study in West Africa, in Senegal, and as well as others went to West Africa. And that was the most important educational experience of my life. Young Africans today don't have that opportunity. So we are moving more into this cultural chauvinism, these identities, and there's a global project, a global right-wing project for fragmentation of Africa. I mean, we've seen it. I'm sure you've seen the article that argues by a Zionist who was an observer to the AU, who actually argues for Africa must disintegrate, starting with South Africa. And this Afrophobic project, I believe, I'm not saying that it's entirely a result, but I'm saying it's certainly stimulated by that political project to divide Africans. So we somehow have to find a way to fight for a Pan-African, to build a Pan-Africanism from the ground. And I just want to imagine if we had a SADC university in Limpopo province, along the lines of what was the Botswana Lesotho Swaziland University, and what we could produce in the region if we have youth from across the region in such a university. We have to find a way to build this Pan-Africanism. And I regret that our African billionaires don't seem to see that need. And where do we get the kind of resources we need to build that regional solidarity and regional economic projects? If you look at how we are all begging the United States for tariffs, bilateral trade, and Trump not to impose these tariffs on that. When Lesotho was given that 100% or whatever tariff for their garment producers, why couldn't that material be bought across SADC, and especially in South Africa? So the economic, I think also what's important is the economic consequences for South Africa, the negative economic consequences, because there's reaction across the continent to South African business. There's anger against South Africa. And I think this poses serious risks. South Africa has been deindustrializing. Who are South Africa's major markets? Cyril Ramaphosa went to East Africa on a trip not so long ago. I think a couple of years ago, and he came back and he said African countries are buying from the East, buying from Asia and India, products which they could be buying in South Africa. So I think it's important for us to look at ourselves as regional citizens and to push this notion that economic development, economic survival, and economic progress anywhere in the region is dependent on creating a larger regional market. And that for South Africa, especially South African manufacturing industry, who are South Africa's major buyers, and also tourism. I was informed by someone in one of the tourism councils that tourism from Africa to South Africa has gone down significantly. There's a loss of, and unfortunately, the level of economic literacy in the people that propagate this Afrophobia is so huge that they don't understand that South African earns a lot from South African tourism. Meetings that would have taken place in Durban at the International Convention Center at Durban are being cancelled. South African artists who have gigs in Zimbabwe or Mozambique or other African countries, their performances are being cancelled. So there is an economic loss. There may be a few domestic worker jobs here and there, but there is an economic loss. Landlords who had migrants who depended on an income from renting back rooms to migrants, that income is lost. The retail sector is suffering. The taxi industry, the passengers, they've lost passengers, so they'll have to make up for that loss of traffic by raising prices. So I think the IOM presentation was good but I think there's a narrative that is propagated through social media, and this is one of the dangers of AI and social media, a never-ending stream of hate speech and disinformation that gives people completely the wrong idea. And just as in the 1980s and 90s, you had the black-on-black violence in South Africa where people in the hostel dwellers were convinced that they had to kill township residents because when the ANC takes over, they'll be sent back to the rural areas that they came from. It's the same kind of disinformation that is perpetuated now, that these migrants are taking your jobs, and it takes the eyes away from the corruption. If you look at Tembisa Hospital, I mean, the corruption, monumental corruption of millions, hundreds of millions of rands, which could have employed doctors, nurses, porters. The amount of money that is eaten up by corruption, and not only in South Africa, but in Zimbabwe as well. The taxes the Zimbabwean economy imposes on the population. We've been looking at some of the people that have lost jobs here and thinking, how could we help them in Zimbabwe? But the businesses in Zimbabwe that we look to are being so highly taxed that they are having to, their capacity to employ more workers is diminished because of the taxes that are being paid by the governments. So in short, I really think that a very detailed documentation and data giving numbers, because a lot of what is the debate, even the media, what the media is putting out is based on assumptions, it's based on myths, it's based on wrong information. The other thing I want to say is that the narrative is that this is against undocumented migrants, but it is not. There's a campaign to remove all migrants, and especially at the universities. I don't know if you've seen a very false report that the education department at a certain university has been taken over by Nigerians. And this is the kind of thing that is going on, which is threatening to the academic project, a kind of chauvinism, I don't know what's the word, parochialism, that is actually universities are coming under pressure that they are hiring too many foreigners. So it's not, it's mainly against the working class, but there is a more general, I think Maga Hambe goes beyond that. And you even have members of cabinet, a member of cabinet that said he's Gayton McKenzie, said he supports Donald Trump and would like to have ICE in South Africa. So we are in a very grim situation in the region. And for me, I feel one of the solutions really is to mobilize resources to have create a regional cohort of young people who will have the same opportunities that we did to build regional solidarity and to be able to participate. South Africans need to also be taught that they are part of a continent and not an island. And the educational, and for us that work in that educational space, it's our duty to do so, right from the books that little children read, right up to the tertiary institutions. And finally, we're approaching Mandela Day. 18th of May is Nelson Mandela's birthday. And I just have to say that these movements, these anti-migrant movements, the whole Magahambe formations that are essentially vigilante groups are an antithesis of everything that Nelson Mandela stood for. And unfortunately, it seems that those who have been voted in to continue Mandela's traditions and the traditions of the liberation movement seem to have forgotten that and are bowing down to this kind of reactionary vigilantism, which is very tragic for not only for the people of the region, but for South Africans themselves.
Thanks, Eleanor. I think you came with a very strong recommendation. And I think in summarizing now, quickly, you have said your piece. And the idea of the UN International Rapporteur, and I would have to ask Diane when she says the final word, what she thinks of that. How can we go about it? I think it's a very good idea. It was made necessary in 2005 in Zimbabwe. I think it is equally the narrative from both Eleanor and Vavi makes it very clear. The reports we're getting of the conditions of the people who have been thrown out is enough of a humanitarian crisis to warrant a rapporteur. Vavi has also suggested a number of to keep the pressure on the state in South Africa. The state must find an alternative accommodation for the migrants who are being removed from South Africa. And the state must implement its own laws, law and order, and above all, international solidarity, which was also echoed by Eleanor just now. I would like to start, therefore, with Fernando. Your last word. Eleanor has given us her last words. Your last words, what to be done?
Well, I think I agree with pressure in different levels, but what is the legitimacy of most of the governments in the region? This is a big question mark. Two, what is the legitimacy of these former or still claiming to be the liberation movements of Southern Africa? There is a problem also of legitimacy. Our civil society organizations are very busy to fight our own domestic fights. So I would say that probably one of the solution is going to approach the economic angle. And as for one of the debates across the migrations across the Mediterranean Sea is to create economic conditions in our own countries in order to avoid such a massive movements to South Africa, and South Africa could do, and South African businesses and South African economy can do much better in our economies, or at least and particularly in a Mozambican economy, if certain barriers will be transformed, if there will be a more friendly economic environment for across the border businesses to evolve and to be developed. Maybe this is not such a kind of a warm solution, but I believe that the economy and people involved, the economic agents, can do a lot to reverse this situation in Southern Africa, and particularly when it turns to the relation between South Africa and Mozambique. But as you said, Ibo, the same thing should apply in relation to Zimbabwe and Mozambique, Malawi and Mozambique. So we talk a lot about cooperation and about solidarity, but we don't do much of cooperation and solidarity across so many countries. Even Angola, we speak the same language we as Angola, and we are much every day we feel that we are more apart from Angola than it was before, during the liberation days or immediately after the independence. It's like Angola is a very far away country. So I have a very skeptical view on things and how things would evolve facing the present crisis. But yes, I believe that in the economic front, there's a lot of things that can be done in order to avoid this massive unbalanced migration to South Africa. And this can be reversed by creating job opportunities in our own countries and with capital, with investments in our own countries.
Obrigado, Fernando. Tendai, what can be done now? What can be done urgently to handle the humanitarian crisis? We don't have
yes, thank you so much.
Carry on.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof. I think the most important urgent thing that we need to do, the most urgent thing that we need to do is solidarity, has already been highlighted by nearly every speaker here. Of course, this cannot not be expected from the former liberation movements. They've already exhibited their, bias and their lager mentality, that they stick together. They never hold each other to account. As Zimbabweans, we've been experiencing this for the past 25 years. We have had elections, rigged elections. We've had repressive policies, but not once has SADC stood with the people of Zimbabwe. They've stood together with the leadership. And as we are talking right now about mass migration of Zimbabweans into South Africa, remember when this started in the early 2000s, even the South African leader at the time, Thabo Mbeki, claimed that there was no crisis in Zimbabwe. And yet people were being brutalized, including Operation Murambachina that you have mentioned, where the 2008 killings of suspected opposition supporters. So nothing can really come out of SADC. But as civil society, we've already got people like Comrade Vavi in South Africa. We've got Fernando in Mozambique. You are here in Zimbabwe, Prof, and others. Let's work together. let's put our efforts together and put pressure on our governments that they finally put the interests of their people first. We are all migrants, as you said, Professor, at the beginning of this discussion. I myself am a second-generation Zimbabwean. My grandfather is from KwaZulu-Natal. My actual surname is Mpofana, with a P, not with a B. That has been Shonanized. So I'm actually, my grandfather was a migrant from South Africa. So we have to accept that this message has to go to all those that are in South Africa to understand that we are all migrants and there's nothing wrong with migration. And we have to accept each other as migrants, and it was part and parcel of the liberation struggles of our respective countries that they were based on migration. Jacob Zuma, as already mentioned, was in Mozambique for most of that time. So let's have civil society putting pressure on our governments to fix their economies. We need pressure on the United Nations to dispatch a UN rapporteur to look into what is happening right now in South Africa. It's a mess. It's a crisis. It's a humanitarian crisis. You know, I was watching the news just 2 weeks ago of Zimbabweans and Malawians who have been stranded in the open for the past weeks, you know, ever since the 30th of June protests. No abolition facilities. They don't even know where to bath. Some were saying that they had not bathed in days, and eating is another thing. So how can we take that as normal? That is not normal. That is a humanitarian crisis. So we need civil society, we need pressure groups to come together to put pressure, and also for the UN to dispatch a UN rapporteur, and also to pressure the governments of our various countries to put pressure on each other to implement real change, real economic policies that create opportunities, that empower the people rather than to empower those that are in power. So those are the things that I can say we need to recommend. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tendai. Thanks very much. Favi, can you have made the recommendation already. What we want to do is ask you, how do you think we can begin effecting all these recommendations, beginning with the UN rapporteur, about which I will ask Diane for advice. I don't want to involve her too much in our domestic affairs as Africans here. But Vavi, we want some agency through which to have these recommendations implemented. That from this dialogue, we must emerge, and we have taken note as SAPIS, want to emerge with a program of action to deal with this urgent humanitarian crisis. Fabi?
I find myself with almost nothing to add to the very rich interventions and recommendations that the comrades who spoke before me have already made. So I want to endorse all of that. But I just want to add this dimension. We dealt with the 2005 crisis under the Mugabe and Mbeki regimes. I think that we are dealing with the same crisis again, the extension of the term of office by Mnangagwa, with President Ramaphosa flying over to give him a big smiles and then meeting with the dodgy characters of Zimbabwe and come back with little consequences to face in South Africa. In my view, this is history repeating itself. This is exactly what happened. And Eleanor, I've been watching, comrade, even the former President Mbeki, good as he is on this matter of xenophobia and the condemning the diversion and the scapegoating of the migrants, but there is still the old conspiracy theory around, for example, the 2008 wave of xenophobia that was the biggest and killed most of the people in South Africa. In that he seemed to suggest that that was actually, he says there was no xenophobia. there was a deliberate stoking of tensions in order to force Zimbabweans to go home. And when you look at this very clearly, who would have benefited politically from Zimbabweans returning home, it would have been MDC. It makes me to remember the connection now that when the unions were still very strong in the region, when there were battles in South Africa against austerity programs, in Mozambique, even though the OTM other says there was never really independent from Limo, but at least there was some battles that it was waging around the prices of bread. And if you look at what was happening under the ZCTU before it was hopelessly divided, and as well as the Namibian trade union movement, there was a big conspiracy by all of the former liberation movements that the unions were under the dictatorship and control of the foreign forces hostile to the liberation movement, CIA in particular. So when you suddenly hear that there was stoking of violence in Alexander in order to force Zimbabweans to go home for the benefit of the MDC, you can't forget that, by the way, this conspiracy theory could be very, very dangerous, and, because it is a conspiracy theory that says we don't have to take responsibility because there's some international agenda to defeat the liberation movement in Zimbabwe using the MDC and or the unions or the civil society and all of that. So we back into those uncharted waters, and which makes me to say the idea that we must continue to build solidarity, increase interaction between unions, even if they have been wholly fragmented and weakened, increase the interaction between the civil society in the region and the rest of the continent, is the best way to put pressure on the governments. And I want to emphasize very, very strongly that we will always be talking about migration crisis as long as there is uneven development in our region. You can't have one country being the force of attraction, and when it is surrounded by deepening crisis next door. And that's why we need to say, yes, South Africa is deindustrializing and more people are getting unemployed and more levels of poverty and all of that. But there can be no successful reindustrialization in South Africa without a coordinated developmental approach in the entire region as well as in the entire continent. But we don't do that because our leaders have suddenly found conscience. You do that because they face pressure on the ground from the unions and civil society and the people in general who have been educated to understand the very notion of Pan-Africanism, that Africa can never ever survive in small islands, but can survive and strive together. Thank you.
Thanks, Vavi. Thanks. We'll come back to you on that. The role of the unions in conjunction with civil society. Diana, first and the last two. Your last word. First, your comment on Eleanor's recommendation, which we have already accepted. How would one go about it, in your view?
Thank you, Ivo, and thanks again for this opportunity. Allow me to expand a little bit on what the UN here in Zimbabwe and IOM in particular are doing. And obviously, I think independent assessments, documentation are always valuable. And it's important because it allows that evidence base. But there are many different ways of doing that as well. It could take the form of a special rapporteur. It could be an independent fact-finding mission. There are other mechanisms. If it's a UN mechanism, it's ultimately a decision through the UN human rights system as well as member states. But in addition to that, and I think this has come out a lot in these discussions, and Eleanor mentioned youth, civil society. There's many different forms of pressure that have to happen. There's not one solution. Having one rapporteur or fact finding is not necessarily going to lead to a final solution. But definitely we have to look at it in all of those different elements, making sure that there is ways of maintaining and getting that information, that evidence, which is incredibly important, to be able to report what is happening and how people are being affected, and then ultimately what can be done. For us, the key is really ensuring that irrespective of who you are, regardless of nationality or migration status, all humans should be protected from violence, from intimidation, from discrimination, basic human rights, basic support that we should be offering. Of course, we can't ignore the real challenges. And Vavi mentioned that so long as there's inequalities, there will be a migration crisis, even though it's not a migration issue. There are many different issues, but it gets enveloped into this idea that this is a migration crisis. So ultimately, what is important is having the facts, respecting the rule of law, and of course, protecting human dignity. For us, it's very clear. Right now we're focusing on action. We're focusing on supporting people as they come into the country. We're focused on people that are transiting the country, because this is not just a Zimbabwe-South Africa issue, as we saw even from what Fernando is mentioning about Mozambique, but Malawi, other countries as well. So we need to look at this in terms of how do we support people that are on the move, people that are directly affected, or could potentially be affected, particularly if they're in South Africa. And then, of course, what do we do once they're back? How do we support them? And this goes into this idea of welcoming. The social cohesion is incredibly important, and the reintegration support, and understanding how we support these communities the best way we can in the context that we have. Then on a larger regional scale, there are, and we talked about it a bit, but it really is looking at how we see this as not just a South Africa issue. It's regional, it's worldwide, but let's focus on what we can, and at least on a regional basis of really putting in that pressure, that the room for cooperation and discussion. IOM runs for the last 22 years, I believe, the Migration Dialogue for Southern Africa, MITSA, that happens pretty much on a yearly basis. And with the last one was in Zimbabwe in October of last year, which is an opportunity to bring all the SADC countries together to discuss specific issues. Last year it was labor, migration, climate, data, and I'm missing one, alternatives to detention. This is an opportunity also to promote further dialogue, to look at practical coordination, to look at early warning signs, to avoid situations of anti-migrant tensions and blaming migrants, for what could be happening in a specific country or again across the region. So I think we really have to look at this in many different ways and push this on different elements: the practical, the support, the immediate support people need, the long-term support people need, and how do we try to avoid history repeating itself across the region, to really being able to address hopefully the systemic issues, but avoiding people being blamed for these types of situations. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Diana. Thanks very much for the good summary as well. I think we will do a follow-up, our team. First and foremost, for Eleanor, we will go into the legacy documents on the Tibayuka report. I was quite active. In fact, I got into trouble. That's how I lost the newspaper, because I wrote an editorial which said, when the state turns on its people, on Rambochina. And I think we can pull up the documents so that from the South African side, you can begin dealing with the UN agencies there and get this rapporteur in as soon as possible. I will keep in touch with Vavi and the ZCTU here. Marimo, whose number I gave you yesterday, is on our team. We'll see what we can do in conjunction with yourselves in South Africa to get some of these solidarity issues together as a matter of urgency. And Eleanor knows that I'm the interim Secretary General of the Pan-African Movement. It's a matter on our agenda as well. We have to roll back this legacy of chauvinism, Afrophobia in particular. And Afrophobia is really a peculiarly South African situation. You know, it needs a lot of introspection on the part of the leadership itself, but also academia. It's not enough to deny. We need to engage with the problem. Eleanor, say something?
Yes, there was something I forgot to mention, which is really important, is that the main organization helping the migrants on the ground is Gift of the Givers. And so if anyone wants to donate, even the smallest amount would be appreciated, donate to Gift of the Givers. They are actually the ones doing the work on the ground. Well, the main organization assisting people.
Thanks. Then leaves me to thank you, Diana, again, Vavi. Thanks, my comrade, for coming again. Eleanor, Fernando, muito obrigado. Until we meet again.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.